Hey everyone, and welcome to the channel. Fast reads, fast-paced, and action are all things that are extremely popular here on BookTube. So many times I see people talking about palate cleansers and all of these things of books that you can just get through super quick, and there is nothing wrong with that. But I kind of wanted to talk about books on the other side of that spectrum, so I have picked out a bunch of books that I think you should absolutely take your time with and not binge read it, not just try to fly through it as fast as you possibly can. And some of those are because I think the story itself is complex, and some of these are because of the writing, and then I have one that is a mixture of both, and the book that I wish I could go back in time and read again in a completely different way than I did the first time. So let's go ahead and start with the books that I think you should take your time with, mostly because of the writing, not necessarily because the story is overly difficult, but that the writing itself is different enough from what you are going to read in a modern fantasy or sci-fi book. And some of that has to do with age, and some of it just has to do with the writing style itself. So those three series are The Lord of the Rings, Dune, and Wars of Light and Shadow. So we'll go ahead and start with Lord of the Rings because that is probably, the grandfather of all of fantasy. I know people absolutely love this, and most of you have probably read that if you're watching this video. If you have not read it, absolutely should. It is definitely important to the genre, and if you read it for just that reason alone, I think it is absolutely worth it. But I would caution you to not just go and read it as fast as you possibly can. That is something I myself am guilty of. I read Lord of the Rings extremely quickly, kind of back to back to back, and really just kind of pushed through it. I already had watched the movies a long time ago. I read the books much later in life, and I just kind of wanted to say, yes, I have read it, I have experienced it, I get it, I understand why people like it, and whatever. And I'll be the first to admit, I do think that slightly hurt my reading experience. I think it is one of those ones where the writing itself deserves that you sit down and just kind of embrace it a little bit, and that is not something I wanted to do. At the time, I found it rather boring and dry, and I had a difficult time with it. I still liked the books, they were fine. They're not my top favorite series or anything of all time, but I do think it is maybe one of those series that if I took a step back, went back through it and read it slower, I would appreciate the effort that Tolkien is putting into each word he is putting on the page. And that is the same way I actually feel about the Wars of Light and Shadow by Janny Works. This is a series that fortunately I have taken it slow. I haven't just tried to binge read through books. Now, there is definitely a flow to her writing that once you get into, it definitely makes it an easier read. But Janny writes in a way unlike any other author I have ever had the chance of reading. Each word, she feels like she is using the absolute perfect word for what she is trying to tell you. To say in that sentence, it's like the block that holds the entire thing together. She's able to do that repeatedly throughout her books. And like I said, it is different than anything else you will read, so I do think it is one of those series that you need to slow down. And it's going to kind of force you to, because there are going to be words that you're not going to know. And that's kind of part of the fun of it. It has expanded my vocabulary probably more than any other series I have ever read, which is pretty impressive. But I do think this is a series that asks you to just give it that little bit of effort where, yeah, you're going to have to slow down, but you're going to appreciate the words she is saying. And it is honestly really beautiful. The actual prose of her stories is probably my second favorite, just behind Hemingway. And Hemingway is just like a different kind of experience completely. His is much more sparse, and then Janny's is much more rich. And I think it's a great way to compare two different kinds of proses that I like, but I do think you should read this series a little bit slowly, and there's nothing wrong with that. It's not going anywhere. And the reason I mentioned Dune here in the writing is because it is written in a perspective that is very different than anything a modern reader is probably going to experience. I actually don't know of any books off the top of my head that are written in the same manner as Dune, and I'm sure that there are. And I can remember my personal experience when reading Dune. For the first 30-ish% of that book, I was just kind of lost. It really took me a lot of effort to kind of get into the right headspace to understand what was being told to me in the way the story was being told. Now, once that happened, I ended up loving Dune. Dune is one of my favorite science fiction stories of all time. I definitely need to read the sequels at some point, but I do think it is one of those series that if you take your time at the beginning, you will be able to fly at the end. So those were some of the series I wanted to talk about just because of the writing, not necessarily because the story themselves are overly complex or asking a lot of you. Not that they're not, but those aren't the reasons I wanted to put them on the list. This next section is for ones that I think you need to take a little bit of a slower pace because of the story themselves, and that is Crime and Punishment, A Song of Ice and Fire, Malazan, and Hyperion. So let's go ahead and start with Crime and Punishment, because I think most people are pretty familiar with Crime and Punishment. We follow a character who commits a very bad crime. Now, that story doesn't seem very complex or anything, but I think this is one of those stories that is asking you to sit down and evaluate what is going on, and it's more of a philosophical question that's being asked than for you to just experience this story, right? It wants you to think about what is going on, what should be done. And I also think maybe it's asking a little bit, what would you do in this situation? Maybe that's just me. That's I put myself in the situation of the characters in books often. So that is something I asked myself a lot, if for some reason I was in this awful situation, what would I have done? I'd probably never be in that situation. That's the actual answer. But I did find it a fun thought experiment. And I think that is one of the books that if you slow down and appreciate some of the things it's asking of you as a reader, you will get more out of that reading experience than if you just sit there and let the story be told to you. Now, I think some people might be surprised that I put A Song of Ice and Fire on here because the story doesn't seem all that complex. It seems kind of like a traditional story being told you, but I do think a lot of the political maneuverings that are happening the first time through, if you were not spoiled like I wasn't when I read this series for the first time, it's easy to miss some of the things that are going on. There's a lot of characters. You don't know all of the ties between all the families, especially, like I said, if you didn't have all of this spoiled by the show. And I think it's one of those series that if I had taken a little bit more time with, I would have gotten a lot more out and I would have been able to make better predictions down the line. That is one fun thing I had with the series while I was reading it. I was trying to figure out how everything was going to go, how people were going to interact with each other. And if I had slowed down a little bit, because I didn't, I read these books rather quickly, I think it's something I could have enjoyed more. Now, obviously, most people are going to have a lot of stuff spoiled from the TV show and it just being such a part of pop culture. But if you haven't read the books yet, I do think you should. They're fantastic fantasy novels. And I think you'll be able to see what I'm talking about with the political tones that are kind of being put out in the front so you can see what's going on, but some of the undertones and the maneuvering that people are doing behind the scenes is fantastic. Now, Hyperion is another one of those ones where I don't think the story is overly complex, but I do think it is a story that is asking you to be patient. I think if you look at the book itself, like the front cover has the Shrike on it, which is this weird monster, and if you hear people talk about it, you hear people talk about that, right? And you also hear people talk about how it's kind of a Canterbury's Tales style of story where you have people telling their experiences throughout life. And I think this is a book that does ask you to be patient because you're not 100% sure how this is all going to tie together, where this is all leading. We're just sitting here listening to these pilgrims tell their tale. And while I did really enjoy Hyperion, it was not the story I expected from it. And so I think taking your time with it will let you enjoy each one of those individual stories in of themselves that let you enjoy then the larger picture itself. Now, Malazan is actually the reason I have this whole category. I do think that Malazan, the story itself, is a rather difficult story because so much is happening and because Erikson is not going to hold your hand. He very much just tells the story he wants to tell and he trusts that the reader is going to figure it out at some point. Now, some of those reveals don't come till later books, right? I think there are some things that are hinted at in book 1 that you can figure out that aren't actually confirmed until book 3. And I don't think that's a bad thing. But what I am saying, if you try to binge through this series and just read it super fast, you're going to miss a lot of those little details that will then make some of those reveals not as exciting, or you won't be able to then theorize or figure things out early, which is, to me, one of the fun things in reading, especially a series like that where it's so big and so epic that if you can, pay attention to some of the details, you will see things coming, and that has been is something pretty interesting in that series for me. Now, I know Malazan fans oftentimes say that it's not nearly as difficult as people put it out to be, and I do agree. It is not like it is written in a way you'll never be able to understand anything, but I will say so much is going on. I did a Memories of Ice vlog not that long ago, and I continually said that every 20% of that book I read, it felt like I read an entire novel's worth of information, which I don't think is a bad thing. I think it just shows that this world is super well thought out, that there's so much going on that you're not going to realize, especially your first time through, that slower pace will definitely help you. And now for the last book, this is a book that I personally wish I could go back in time and read differently, and that is Blood Meridian by Cormac McCarthy. When I read this book, I didn't really know what I was expecting. I'm not really somebody who does a lot of research before I read a book. I kind of just hear a little synopsis. Maybe I hear somebody on BookTube talk about it, somebody recommends it to me in a comment, and I just kind of go in and read it, and I don't want my thoughts to be kind of influenced by other people's thoughts, right? I want to be able to give my opinion on something. And this is one of the few books that I wish I could go back and completely change that, because I kind of binged this book. I read it super quickly. I kind of just tried to power through because I didn't understand what was going on. Not that I didn't understand what was going on. I guess I didn't understand the point of the story. I didn't really understand what it was trying to get through to me. And I just didn't connect with this book. And I think part of that is because I binged through it. I think if I had sat back and really slowed down, I would have understood that, one, this is just kind of a tale of the West of America, right? But also just some of the other themes that this book is trying to get through to you, I think I would have enjoyed it much more. I think this is the kind of book where I could have read 5 pages a day and gotten so much more out of it than I did when I initially read it. And this is probably the book that is highest up on my I should reread list. If I had to pick one book to reread, it would probably be Blood Meridian, because I think I would be able to get so much more out of it. But that is my list of books that I think you should take your time with. I guess a lot of those are series, but I would love to hear some of your recommendations. recommendations. I'm sure there are a lot more classic that would fit into this because the writing is so different. We could really slow down and appreciate a lot more of the things going on in it. But I would love to hear any of your recommendations or thoughts down below in the comments. But that's all for me. And as always, have a good one.